Ladies and gentlemen, in our second panel, we will now move on to talking about the political and philosophical relationship between the US and UK. And I am absolutely delighted that we have a truly stellar lineup of panelists. Our chair will be Anne Applebaum, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and author who is currently a professor of practice at the LSE. We have McArdle, the Washington Post columnist, Ryan Streeter of the American Enterprise Institute, and Allister Heath, editor of the Sunday Telegraph, who are one of our sponsors today. All of them fantastically original thinkers, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to have them here. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you. It's great to see such a large group on this sweaty day. I assume you've come here for more than the air conditioning. I'm really pleased to be doing a panel with three such interesting people. You can hear them introduced by their biographies or by their titles or by their university affiliations, but really what we have is McArdle, who's my Washington Post colleague, who's a really iconoclastic thinker and writer about economics, and has been for a decade or more. We have Allister Heath, who is somebody who's thought a lot about everything from tax policy, other aspects of free market economics. We have Ryan Streeter, who's a former Bush administration official, has been worked for Mike Pence when he was Indiana governor, and is also a very kind of thoughtful and forward-looking thinker about modern conservatism. And so that means it's a really good opportunity to talk about the real problem and the real issue today. I was asked as a kind of introduction to this panel to examine the question, is the Anglo-Saxon model still an inspiration to the rest of the world? I spend a lot of time in the rest of the world, and I can tell you I'm afraid that it's not. I was just at an event with a lot of people from Africa and Asia, and was really stunned to hear on a panel much like this one, an African woman say, I'd rather have China investing in my country than the United States. It's more reliable, I trust them more. And that was a disappointing moment. It's my view that this is not an accident, that we have two of our countries, that the United States and Britain are both in crisis at the same time, because we actually all enjoyed a kind of triumph at the same time. You know, the Reagan-Thatcher moment was a real triumph for what we're calling the Anglo-Saxon model, for an idea of free markets, an idea of democracy. And it has, for a variety of reasons that maybe we can discuss, begun to lose its way or lose its appeal. And that, I think, is reflected in the political crisis that we have in conservative parties, both in Britain and the United States. You know, the second question we'll talk about is the US-British partnership. Also a tough thing to really discuss at a moment when some people want to talk about making England great again, others want to talk about American first. Is a partnership possible at all? But let me start with Allister Heath, who's the editor of the Sunday Telegraph, who is, as I say, an eloquent writer on markets. At this moment, when so many are questioning, free market ideology, when so many ask whether the 2009 crisis was caused by the Reagan-Thatcher moment, how do you write about this? How do you talk to your readers about markets in a way that remains appealing? And is this something that is the idea of it still something that's appealing to most people in Britain?
Yes, I do think that we're still living in the shadows of the financial crisis and the massive recession that followed it, and obviously I think that's had a long-term negative impact on people's perceptions of capitalism. But to me, the answer is primarily about rediscovering the kind of mass market, popular conservatism and popular free market policies that we saw in the 70s and 80s and so on. And by that, in the UK context, it's all about spreading ownership again. I think one of the big problems in the UK, and one of the reasons why Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, who is basically a quasi-Marxist, is doing so well, relatively speaking, and why the Tories in many ways have lost their mojo when it comes to economics over the past 10 years is because of the decline of ownership. And I think you need to spread ownership, you need to spread the ownership of financial assets much more than we have in the UK, and you've got to spread...
You mean home ownership or more generally?
Well, financial assets, and I was going to say home ownership too. I think property ownership is in massive crisis in this country. If you live in London or the South East, if you're under the age of 40, there's been a collapse in home ownership, and there's a massive correlation between home ownership and ownership of any kind of financial assets, and having a stake in society and believing in the kinds of things that will make you support the Conservative Party or support the kinds of pro-market policies that I think the country needs and which it's not had. So I think the decline of ownership has been a catastrophe. I think a lot of the policies like the kind of extremely expansionary monetary policy we've seen after the crisis and so on have all militated against this. And I think at the heart of a new Tory offering for the UK, you'd need to see a return of popular ownership. Now, that doesn't talk about America, of course, but I think if you want to renew, if you want to recreate conservatism in Britain, that has to be part of it.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, can you reflect on that from an American point of view? Is it that we need to rediscover markets? Is it we need to rediscover, or are we missing something else in modern conservatism?
We're probably missing a couple of things, but I would piggyback off of what Allister just said and echo the sentiments really and take it in a complementary but a little bit of a different direction. I think we need to rediscover dynamism again in our political discourse and as a matter of sort of policy agenda setting. I think what's happened in the US, I think it's happened here as well, is you've seen a movement kind of away from the sort of optimism that is sort of presupposed by the belief that people can actually start, build, and make things. And sell them into expanding markets, and it's become kind of on the right in America and on the intellectual right. It's become sort of out of fashion to talk about entrepreneurs and dynamism. It sounds like you're on the side of technology companies and you're on the side of big business when you talk that way. And so we've seen a move to really double down on making employment more bearable and comfortable, with the idea that no one's ever going to be anything more than an employee unless you're fortunate enough to have an advanced degree and be in the executive class. And that's a very stark departure from an understanding that that self-employment, that opportunity, lots of churn, hopping from one firm to another should be possible for as many people as possible, not just for kind of an elite class of people. And I think we would do well to draw on the work of someone like Edmund Phelps, a Nobel laureate, who's worked on this a lot, because what's really interesting in Phelps' work, and I think he's too neglected in sort of our economic discussions about a policy agenda, is that over time, a dynamic society where you don't have enough people creating, making, building, tinkering, as he calls it, at kind of every level of society, people actually change over time. And you actually lose the ability to live that way. And you need different parts of the population. You need makers, you need people that know how to finance that kind of thing, you need people that know how to market it, and you need consumers that provide you the kind of reliable feedback. And unfortunately, that first class is really diminished, and it's not a surprise that we've seen this long-running sort of decline in new firm formation in the country, and that the only kind of fast-growing new firms are those that have like Delaware registrations and patents. That these are companies that are more sophisticated. And I think that sort of vision of the country where grassroots innovation and entrance into markets is available to a wide swath of people, not just highly educated ones. I think there's an appetite for that kind of economic populism, but it's become quite out of fashion to talk that way. And I think the consequences of that long term are not good for us.
But doesn't what you say also imply the need for a safety net of the kind that we haven't traditionally advocated, or has not been traditionally advocated by the conservative right in the US and the UK, so that people can move from job to job?
Absolutely. I mean, we could certainly have a much more efficient safety net. It could be modeled on safety nets over here. It could be modeled on safety nets in Nordic countries. I mean, it's a very inefficient one. It consists of multiple programs run by different agencies with different cultures and different rules. And so it's the incentives for people to enter that safety net structure, depending on where they are in the labor market, if they've been displaced, are sort of too easy, and exiting that structure is too difficult, or the incentives just aren't really there. So clearly there needs to be reform there. we find ourselves kind of obsessing right now on sort of the intellectual right and these debates in the age of Trump, trying to figure out what type of wage subsidy structures we should have. There's kind of this belief we're just giving up on this view of dynamism, which is not the same thing as growth. And Phelps is very, very good at articulating this. Growth follows from it. But dynamism has to do with this particular set of institutions and habits and practices and a culture, really, that supports the creation of new things and finding markets for them, and that's available to a wide swath of people. And, 50 years ago that was the case, where it's not anymore. That rhetoric is almost gone from our political debate and vocabulary right now. We're having these debates on the right and the left, mostly about making employment more comfortable for more people. And while there are merits to that, and we're not having those debates without good reason, I think long term the effects are particularly bad for our economy.
Megan, maybe you could reflect a little bit on this idea that we just need to rediscover our free market roots, and that there's that these are the questions of ownership, or what or what we need to return to. Do you think that's correct, or do you think that we've moved on to another era and we need to rethink what conservatism means?
Oh man, there's a lot in that question. So I would say first one thing, which is that when I started, my first journalistic job was at The Economist, and back then Germany was just going to destroy us, right? The German model was so much better than the American and British model. I remember calling a French economist who is friendly to the government about the 37-hour work week in France and saying, well, are you worried that this is going to cost jobs? And he said, no, that's Anglo-Saxon economics. We do not believe in that. Eventually Anglo-Saxon economics did seem to win over the French model. Their unemployment is very high. So I think that there's, Germany wasn't the only one, right? Before that it was Japan, and Japan was going to destroy the Anglo-Saxon model. And now it's China. And China has its own problems, and right now China looks ascendant. And they can do certain things that the Anglo-Saxon model doesn't, right? They can do something like Belt and Road. That's not really something that the US, for a variety of reasons, is capable of. But I think that they're structural. They're getting old faster than we are. And that's something we really should talk about. All of our societies are getting old. And old economies just don't look as good to people as young economies, because old people with, I am rapidly becoming one, so this is no offense to old people, but if you think about just the decision to become an entrepreneur, right? If you're 20, first of all, you have a lot less to lose. Second of all, you have boundless energy. But third of all, if you hit big, you have decades to enjoy it, right? Now, if you're 55 and you take that same risk, you have just a much shorter time frame to enjoy the benefits. And so it actually just changes the calculation for doing things like dynamism and entrepreneurship. So I think that is a problem, and that problems that look like they're problems with policy are actually often demographic problems. But I will say China has the same demographic problem. Everywhere except Africa has that demographic problem right now. And it's just going to get worse. And so I think that is we have new challenges, is what I would ultimately say. And I look at the United States where, the Republican Party, what's the one thing they can still do even with Trump in charge? Massive tax cut. Tax cuts ran out, I think, as an economic strategy decades ago. The marginal tax rate on most people is low enough that it just doesn't seem like anyone except maybe high-income women married to high-income men, which is a pretty small group. No one else seems to be very responsive to these changes at marginal tax rates at the margin that we're working at in the United States. Politically, they ran out because most people effectively pay no income tax. They pay other taxes. So I'm not saying, they're lucky duckies and they don't contribute, but they don't pay the income tax. And so fiddling with the income tax rate doesn't really actually change much. But that's still the one thing that Republicans can get behind, because that's what the donor class likes. And so, deregulation, the Republican Party has been much less good on, just much less consistent on, something that I think is really important for dynamism. But the Republican Party is not attacking things like the housing restrictions that, especially in England, this is much less of a problem in America, where millennial homeownership is going up, they're recovering from the Great Recession, because we still have a lot of land to build on, and we have a lot of cities. In Britain, it's much more likely to be about London, and the property market here is just sclerotic with all of these housing restrictions. But American cities like San Francisco, New York, Washington, Boston, we have these problems too. And where are Republicans on really fixing those problems? Where are Republicans on occupational licensing, which prevents people from starting a new business because you need a license to become a hair braider in many states? right? These things are the things where the Republican Party and the Conservatives are not hitting hard. And I venture to say that British Conservatives are also not really hitting hard on those issues. And so because we're not actually moving towards removing many of the things that are preventing us from making as much of what we have demographically as possible, instead we're ending up on the other side of it, trying to, well, how do we patch this hole? Rather than fixing the disease, we're trying to cure the symptoms.
Just in answer to the question you just asked previously, which was, is this the only thing that should be done? I mean, I'm not arguing that this is the only
No,
thing
I don't mean to imply that you're saying that. I'm just saying it's a big problem that we should be
I think the situation
on.
in the UK is much, much worse even than it is in America when it comes to that, right?
Yes,
when it comes to deregulation.
No, when it comes to any rhetoric or policies or campaigning in favor of free market economics, right, in general. So I think there has been no consistent major Tory government or Tory in opposition campaign in favor of free markets since probably 2005, something like that, right? So that's almost 15 years where the language of either the government or the main opposition has been rowing back on free markets.
But isn't that for a reason? Isn't that because these policies this kind of language is now unpopular?
Well, we started well before the financial crisis. That's what I mean. So the financial crisis did have and still has a major impact in terms of making people less pro-capitalist. But way before then, the Tories stopped making the case. If no one's making the case, then it's not particularly surprising that public policy drifts.
But isn't there a reason why no one's making the case? I mean,
no, I think they're wrong. I think they think there's a reason, which is that you can't sell it and that we've got to be stuck in some sort of mush.
But it's also it's not just that you can't sell it; it's perceived to have failed, and people.
No, yeah, but I don't think it particularly perceived to have failed in 2004, 2005, because that was before the financial crisis, right? And if it's perceived to have failed, it's because, for example, house prices are incredibly high. If you go and ask people why house prices are so high, they think the market's failed. Absolutely. But it's obvious that the market hasn't failed because the market is completely hemmed in this country. Same thing on tax. So on tax, we've got all sorts of taxes in this country that are punitive and that do have a big impact. For example, we've got what we call stamp duty, which is basically a tax on transactions for housing, which is incredibly high and clearly has massively reduced the number of transactions. There's all sorts of other taxes. The tax ratio in the UK is roughly speaking at a 50-year high right now, possibly even more. Very, very high level of taxes historically. Why? Because we're spending more and more and more and more. We haven't, no one has resolved this problem, and even the Tories, as we can see now in the leadership contest, huge auction to spend more and more money, spend much more on healthcare, spend much more on education and so on. So, there's been supposedly austerity for years, but the tax ratio is at a 50-year high, and all the pressure is to spend a lot more, and ultimately that has to be taxed more. So the Conservatives in this country have a problem, which is they are stuck in this sort of social democratic consensus place. You've got a Labour Party that's hard left, that basically doesn't accept capitalism at all, that wants mass renationalizations, that wants to reopen property rights on a grand scale, that wants massive increases in capital taxation, wealth taxation, all those kinds of things have never happened before in British history, literally. And the Conservatives don't really have a rhetoric or a set of policies to address this. I just don't agree that it is obvious that markets have failed. I think the past 15 years have been a cultural disaster politically in this country because the Conservatives have refused to make the case for free market economics. Now, that's not enough. I think you need much more, right? You need political reform, you need cultural change. There's all sorts of problems in the British model at the moment. And you've got Brexit, obviously, which we haven't discussed yet. You've got all sorts of issues on defence and security and everything, identity and so on. But the Tories need to find a new way of believing in and selling a version of free market economics which is modern and contemporary and which addresses people's needs in the current day.
Ryan, can I bring you in? Maybe you can reflect on that same problem in the United States. But keeping in mind, there's another piece of the story, which is the growth in inequality, which is, if not an economic issue, is a political issue. That it's a thing that bothers people. It's something that can be, politicized and wins points for people like Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders in the United States. Is this something that conservatives should be worried about? And if so, should they be doing anything about it?
It certainly wins political points. There's no doubt about that, and it's clear that it's a problem. Where it's a problem, I remain fairly convinced that most people in the United States anyway aren't motivated by this issue as much as political leaders want them to be. And when you ask people how much they care about this vis-a-vis other issues, I don't know that it always registers that high. We tried to get at it a different way through a large kind of in-depth survey that we just did recently at the American Enterprise Institute, and found that when it comes to various measures of the American dream, different definitions that people use. We have this thing called the American dream, but we mean different things by it. So we asked a very large nationally representative sample to tell us which things they thought were essential to the American dream. And the essential, important, not essential, not important. We asked people, tell us just what you think. And so this gets at people's aspirations and their views of things. Being free to live my life as I choose is the number one thing. Almost 9 in 10 Americans say that's essential to the American dream. Having a fulfilling family life comes in sort of in second place. Having a better life than my parents, upward mobility measure, it's about half. It's a much lower number. This is just one example. There's other survey data to show that people have different views about what the good life actually means, and they want to live in a society that allows them to do those things. Does this mean that 9 in 10 Americans are libertarians? No, they're not self-identifying as such. This cuts across every demographic. There's something about that notion of freedom has packed within it the ability to kind of pursue my dreams, to kind of make of my life what I want to make of it, and not have people tell me what that has to be. That resonates very, very strongly with people. I think I think political inequality or economic inequality it's a very convenient thing for politicians to use to try to motivate people's support for certain types of policy changes. I tend to think there's actually a lot of opportunity to tap into people's desire for a more optimistic view of opportunity than others might right now. I'm not particularly optimistic about our current politics to achieve that, but I don't think that markets have failed. I agree with Allister on this. I don't think that markets have failed to the degree that our political class is saying that they are, and I think being able to recast what a vision for economic progress actually looks like at the grassroots is something that no one's really tried in a while, and I think that we should experiment with that. And Megan already kind of beat me to the punch on some of the policy ideas. Things like licensing reform, getting rid of non-compete agreements for low-income workers. These are not sexy things, but they actually, this regulatory sclerosis that we have at all layers of our government on very important institutions for people's upward mobility and prospects, that's where the action is right now. And I don't see a political coalition of people on the right who've kind of internalized that and figured out what that looks like. And you could draw on some pages from the past where you actually have members of Congress, governors, even mayors, working on similar types of things. We saw reforms like this domestically in the 1990s in America, where you had governors and members of Congress speaking the same language, pursuing certain objectives around a certain set of ideals. We should be doing that on these issues that we were just talking about right now, and we're not. So it's very convenient for people to use the inequality argument to kind of bash the failure of free markets when there aren't sort of bright, forward-thinking people proposing the alternative.
And I will say too that inequality. It is an obsession with a certain class, but it's fundamentally an elite obsession. And fundamentally, it's about people who are pretty well off, who are obsessed with the people who are very well off. And if you look at who people actually compare themselves to, like people who make $45,000 a year do not compare themselves to Warren Buffett. They compare themselves to the school teachers in their town. And the school teachers compare themselves to the college professors and so forth. We compare ourselves to our near neighbors. And so when you look at what the inequality debate is actually shaped around, it's shaped around affluent, educated people living in cities who are really tired of competing with investment bankers for housing and educational slots. And that they are very passionate about this. And they have a lot of voice on social media that they would not have had 20 years ago, right? So one of the things that you're seeing is that this class of people is able to get better organized than it ever has, and it's louder than it ever has. And it convinces those of us in the media who just happen to share these concerns that this is actually the most important issue facing America today. But if you talk to ordinary voters, they're much more focused on quite idiosyncratic things, right? They're focused, first of all, on their partisan loyalties, but second of all, on it was funny, reading about what undecided voters wanted in the 2012 election. And it'd be like, I want Obama to fix the potholes in front of my house. And it's like, well, that's not really what the President of the United States does, right? But that's how normal voters think. They're looking at their own lives and bread and butter issues. And I will say, too, that I think a lot of the populist revolt that we're talking about as a challenge to the Anglo-Saxon model has to do with the fact that the elites got such good control of their parties and focused quite different ideological agendas on the obsessions of this quite small class of very influential people. And if you look at things like, we go back to, what did free markets mean? It meant open borders and low taxes and lots of immigration, because those are the things elites want. We didn't focus on the things like occupational licensing that were making it, or housing restrictions that were making a big deal for younger people and people at the bottom. And similarly on the Democratic side, right? You look at today, for my column preview, I'm going to be writing about Bernie Sanders' new plan to forgive student loan debt, right? This is basically a giveaway to the upper middle class. But that's a class of people who cares a lot about that issue, even though, you know, in the bottom half of the American income distribution, most people don't get a 4-year degree, and so most of the benefit is never going to go to them. And by the way, that is not something that is fixed by making college free. It's still the case in Ireland and Germany and so forth that this distribution is upper class parents are much more likely to send their kids to college. And I think that ultimately, if the Anglo-Saxon model wants to thrive, and I really believe it will, I'm a sort of fundamentalist on this, is that I think that every model has its problems. No model is ever going to be perfection. And so it will keep stumbling, and there will be moments when other models look better. But I think that over the long haul, the Anglo-Saxon model really has proven to be the most durable and the most persistent. But I think that in order to meet this moment, that people who are advocating for it need to be able to look beyond the interests of upper middle class, highly educated people, because they're not the only people in the world. They're not even the majority of people in either of our countries.
I also think that the focus on inequality is misleading for a number of reasons. I mean, for a start, in the UK, income inequality is not going up. You know, people think it has, but it hasn't for quite a long time. Secondly, you know, are people talking about income inequality, or are they talking about the inequality of wealth, right? And obviously, inequality of wealth gets exacerbated if whole chunks of the population are, you know, frozen out of the housing market. Though in the UK, even that hasn't got as much worse, unlike what people think. But I think there's all sorts of other inequality, you know, inequality of educational opportunities and inequality of social capital, of, you know, family, all that sort of stuff. And I think all those kinds of issues are really, really important. And I think the inequality that's emerged between people with university degrees and people without university degrees is a really important one. And there's been far too much focus on graduates and increasing number of graduates, and not enough focus on how do you make sure that people who don't go to university get trained in certain ways and are able to increase their incomes in those sorts of ways. And I do think it is a negative that our societies have become more fake meritocratic, in other words, governed by, you know, paperwork, right? You've got to have a particular degree, a particular qualification. You've had to stay at university until the age of 25 or whatever if you want to get a job, all that sort of stuff. I think the rigidity that's come in from the way education's evolved and the demise of non-formal kinds of education, non-vocational education, non-training and so on, has been really, really problematic. And I think in the UK and in America, this has proved toxic, actually, in certain respects. So I think that whole aspect is very, very important. And that's why I often get quite frustrated when people talk about inequality, because what do they really mean by it?
Yeah, I first of all really want to second this, is that, and this goes back to what is in the interests of the educated class to make education ever more valuable. But I really want to second this, because what the income mobility data in the US shows, at least, is that the inequality and the immobility that we tend to focus on is the distance between the top 1% and the top 20%, right? Because that's what journalists, the journalists who write about it, that's the class they belong to, right? But if you look at what the data actually shows, what matters for mobility, what matters for community health, is the distance between the top 20%, that educated upper class, and everyone else. And if you look at like the town my mother grew up in the 1950s, it was very integrated, right? My grandfather barely finished high school and was very politically influential, had a great upper middle class life by building a business, and, you know, started out as a grocery boy and worked his way all the way up, right? And he went around with doctors and lawyers, but also mechanics and guys who owned other small businesses, right? It was a very economically integrated town, and that is a story that you hear over and over. right? Paul Krugman talks about the fact that his dad was an accountant and he lived next door to a plumber who made more than his father did, right? That has changed. Now that class is segregating itself into increasingly hived off areas where other people can't
So there is an inequality issue. It's just not only the one about the very rich.
Sorry,
Ryan.
yeah.
Yeah, the geographic component is absolutely fundamental, and that's what's new. And I see this, I mean, personally in my own life. The high school I went to in Indiana, about a third of the kids came from farms or their dads worked in warehouses, and the others were professional class. Now it's completely, it's the top 10%. And I was just going to make one point related to that, which is in the United States, I think it's no mistake that when we look at efforts on domestic policy reforms going back over the last 30 years, we've had massive reforms really driven by the states on our primary education, K through 12. We have a much different kind of marketplace for education now, disrupted by charter school laws and even voucher laws, and now education savings accounts laws. And that's been an area of kind of creative disruption in a way that's been, on balance, I think good for students and families. And now we've not been able to figure out how to reform our higher education institutions, but that's where all the energy is, and that's what the candidates are talking about, whether it's free college or whether it's forgiving loans for students that go to college who, as Megan says, come from upper class families. It's no mistake that this one area of human capital development that has been just completely off the radar screen of reform has to do with vocational training, post-secondary non-collegiate training. Every single governor in the country cares about it. 40 of 50 of them put it in their state addresses last year. I mean, they realize that that we have failed an entire generation of people who don't want to go to college to get a four-year degree, but they need some professional certification that the market's actually demanding right now. And you have Republicans and a few Democrats floating around this, trying to actually produce a piece of legislation that would do something. But there's absolutely no energy on this because it's not been within the class of society we're talking about. It's just not been within their interest.
Yeah, so let me just interrupt. This is very interesting. So we have now several different policy ideas that the three of you have thought about a lot, obviously, whether it's higher education reform or whether it's deregulation at some very micro, granular levels, or whether it's, rethinking how, finding ways to make sure that young people own property and so on. Why is it then, what is wrong with our Anglo-American political systems right now that these subjects are not in the news? This is not what we're talking about. Obviously not in the United States. Obviously not. I'm not even going to tell you what we're talking about right here because we all know it's. We'll be talking about it at the coffee break, but and we'll get back to that on the next panel when they talk about the possibility of a UK-US trade deal. But is there something that's gone wrong with the Anglo-Saxon political model, which is explaining why the economic model seems to be stuck in, you have the Republican Party saying the only thing we can do is tax cuts, and the Tory Party saying the only thing we can do is Brexit. So what do you think has gone wrong? Who would like to begin?
Shall I kick off just quickly? I think something has gone badly wrong, and I think it's that the political parties, at least the Conservative Party, has suffered from elite capture, and it ceased to. In fact, all political parties in the UK ceased to. So political parties have often had certain elite views which were different to the mainstream and also different to their own members, policies they promoted. And often I like those policies. But the point is, often what happened was a policy was promoted by a party and then gradually the rest of the country caught up. So you had, for example, the death penalty in the UK. So elite politicians didn't like it, and gradually the rest of the population, a lot of them sort of fell behind that. So you still have quite a lot of support for the death penalty, but it's much lower than it used to be. That's just an example, and there's others. On the other hand, these parties also pursued certain policies where the public didn't just change their minds, and the public kept their views, but the parties became more and more radicalized, and what you effectively had was a political market that didn't work. There were too big of barriers to entry, and you had increasing alienation between these political parties and the public. And we, fast forward a little bit, and you end up in a situation we currently have in the UK where, if you look at the latest opinion polls, there's literally 4 political parties that are vying for 20-something% of the vote, and everything's broken down. You've got, a full-on semi-communist party, you've got a Brexit party, you've got a Conservative party, You've got the Liberal Democrats, effectively Remainer Party. You've got the Greens that are resurgent also as a fifth sort of
This
party.
is very European, ironically.
Yes,
Multiple
right, exactly, yes. That's exactly what's happened, absolutely. And in fact, I think that, I grew up in France, and exactly the same thing happened in my view in France, but starting a long time before then. You had the establishment and the elites capturing their parties. Their views were quite different to the public. For example, on crime, law and order in the 80s in France, the establishment didn't care, the public cared. People started voting for random people and all sorts of things. So I think when there's a breakdown between, when the political market isn't reflecting these opinions, things go wrong. Now, in many cases, of course, I quite like elite opinion in certain areas. But I think what happened in Britain shows the dangers of this. And I think it's basically pretty broken now. And I still think it can be put together again. But I'd like to see quite a lot of long-term reforms. I'd like to see much more participation, more kind of, yes, I'm going to say this, more referendums. I think we can learn something from the Swiss, for example. I think we need a new constitution, we need constitutional reform. We need all sorts of reforms in this country, politically. The system just doesn't work anymore. You've had devolution in a way that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I think, going back to America, and I'm just an observer of the American scene, but my reflection would be that, and I apologize if I'm totally wrong here, but my observation would be that the constitution and the constitutional settlement is also under a lot of strain, really. And that you've got what we've seen here and in Europe, which is highly active judiciary. You've got the old kind of divisions of powers breaking down. You've got conflict about whether long-run constitutional settlements between states and the centre make sense, whether the equality between the states makes sense, all that sort of stuff. And that kind of thing's reflected here too, but in a different way. So that's why I'm actually quite negative about the future of the British political system and the American political system, unless there's quite a lot of reform.
So Megan, do we need a revolution in the United States as well?
So let me make a slightly speculative argument, which is that there is an interesting empirical regularity that if you look at the emergence of revolutionary communications technologies, they are followed within about a decade by actual political revolution. We'll give an exception to the printing press because things moved slower back then, but nonetheless, the Reformation,
there was a big revolution after
There was
that.
a big, the biggest revolution probably in European history followed the printing press. The telegraph in the 1830s,
And then radio.
in 1848, and then we get radio, we get fascism and communism. We get television, and in 1968, in both France and the United States, and the rest of Europe, major political upheavals. And then things settle down. And so what I think is that if you think about, I was thinking about this particularly with the student protests that have convulsed America very recently, right? And why this all started in the 60s. Why was that not a thing before? And part of it is maybe people were more conservative, they would kick out student demonstrators. But students have always been pretty feisty. So why did the perennial demonstrations start in the United States in the 60s? Well, because before the 60s, if you did a student demonstration, like a newspaper reporter would write it up, and no one would care. But in the 60s, it could go on TV. And then you got a lot of publicity for your cause in a way that just wasn't possible before, when you had to interest hundreds of newspaper reporters in order to get any meaningful publicity for your cause, right? But we did settle down to a kind of normal, we learned to manage the student protests. They're not as violent as they were in the 60s. And so similarly with this, if you look at what happened, without Twitter, there is no Trump. It would not have been possible for him to do what he did, an end run around the system. And you have to remember that in the United States, like the number of coincidences that had to line up to let this man into office, whether or not you like him, right, is you needed a massive field that gave a celebrity candidate a huge advantage he otherwise wouldn't have had. You needed his ability to basically bypass the gatekeepers by going to social media and then cable news, as he used social media to get coverage on cable news. You needed a lot of the a lot of the other candidates in the primaries to make incredibly bad decisions, to stay in long past the point where there was any chance that they were going to be either president or vice president or indeed ever spoken to by anyone else in their party again. And so, I think that we're in one of those moments, right? We're in a moment where everything is breaking because people have an ability to organize. And if you look at on the left, there's no sheriff in town with these student protests and with the activists who are overturning stuff in the Democratic Party. There's no one who can stop them because they can organize on social media in a way that, again, wasn't possible more than 10 years ago. But I think that eventually we'll learn to process it, and we will
having made this
restore the
argument,
politics.
yes, having made this argument myself a couple of times, the only caution I would say is that the invention of the printing press led to the Reformation and then to about 100 years
Yes, it was terrible.
of war. Okay?
Fair.
And the invention of radio helped the rise of fascism
Fair.
and communism. Stalin was a great user of radio. And that also led to a war. So we do eventually settle down, but sometimes bad things happen on the way.
I think it's gotten better, though, recently. I will just say that
We'll see.
we didn't have, after television, we didn't have.
Anyway, let me let Ryan come in on this question of why our political systems are so bad at having the kinds of technocratic and gritty arguments that we used to have not even that long ago.
Yeah, I wish I would have gone before Megan, because she was talking about much more exciting and interesting things than my mundane, my planned, very mundane comments. And there's a few things that I could say. What I would focus on is that, one, our political parties have gotten very weak in the United States, and so this is on display in primary season, during presidential elections, and in the perpetual kind of congressional elections that we have. And so the ability for party leaders to actually set agendas on what Americans care about, or maybe even should care about, has gotten quite weak. And then secondly, within Congress itself, which actually is supposed to be the body that makes our laws and sets the direction for the country legislatively, we just don't have a lot of authority anymore in terms of committee chairs who head committees, who's in the old days would actually be the ones who would think about occupational licensing and these sorts of things, and they would hold hearings, and they would have a lot of freedom to have jurisdiction over the area that they were supposedly have jurisdiction. Now we've really removed their authority and placed it in the leadership of the party, which is just more prone to follow where the donor class wants to go and all of that. And I think we just have a very weak congressional institution now. And as my colleague Yuval Levin likes to say, our national institutions have become these platforms for performative expression, and that's this. And so people run for Congress now. Now people run for president so that they can have a platform by which to prioritize whatever it is they want to prioritize, and use it as kind of a celebrity kind of magnet. We see this all the time.
It's not unknown
now.
in this country either.
Yeah, right. And so I think that's part of our problem is just we need some reform in terms of how our Congress functions and how our parties are structured. And I think that's where you actually get some middle American concerns that filter up, where you can actually get things done. And it's just not within the interest of the leadership of those institutions to do that right now. So those are some blocking and tackling reforms, and they sound sort of mundane and all of that, but the change is actually quite pronounced, I think, when you take those things away that those institutions used to have. That's part of the reason we are where we are.
Yeah.
So let me bring up another issue, which is that there's another reason why the Anglo-American model is less admired than it once was, and it's not just because the French and German social market model is opposing it. It's also because there is another growing power in the world, very fast growing, which is operating by a different model, and this is obviously China. And you do hear, as I began saying, you do hear people from Africa, from Asia, talking now about not the Washington consensus, but I mean, they don't necessarily use this expression, but the Beijing consensus. What we need is state capitalism. We need the state directing companies. We need more. Decisions taken at the center. Democracy is a waste of time. It's distracting us from making important decisions. How do we counter that mood and that move? Because and I'm speaking here as a kind of devil's advocate. Obviously, this isn't something I believe in, but we do hear it more. It's growing louder. How can our societies civilizationally fight back?
Well, I think the first thing is why is this happening? By the way, is because people made a mistake at the end of the Cold War, the end of history, arguments, all that kind of stuff, which was that they thought that logically and necessarily, if countries embraced free markets of some kind or moved towards markets, moved towards capitalism, then gradually the societies would liberalize, the politics would liberalize, and you'd end up with this convergence towards some sort of liberal democracy. So most people, myself included, thought this would happen in places like China. We were wrong, right? It might still happen one day, or all sorts of things could happen in China. But the point is, what was predicted didn't materialize, and you ended up with other civilizations emerging, which basically harness lots of market-type policies and lots of market-type thinking, but are not freedom-loving countries. They're not free societies, basically. So that's the first thing that happened. So that thesis failed, and these new countries emerged. Now, of course, they're going to go through their own financial crises and their own massive recessions at some point, and then people might change their minds in the same way that, whenever we have a recession, people often turn for a period of time against our own models. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think, unfortunately, my problem is that I think that the technocratic consensus, which has taken over swathes of establishment thinking in the West, bears too much for my liking. It's too similar for my liking to these other non-liberal democratic models. And so to me, if we want to fight the Chinese model, if we want to fight the Russian model, if we want to fight all these kinds of models, and if we want to create a renaissance in the West, in Britain, in America, and so on, a new belief once again in democracy and in individual freedom, then I think we need to start believing in it ourselves too. And that's why I think there needs to be a lot more things like referendums and things like that. In this country, you need to have people's views more represented, subject to constitutional checks and balances and all that sort of stuff, in Britain in particular. So I think it's quite hard if you believe in technocratic organizations to simultaneously say that you believe in democracy. So I think that's a big thing. We've lost heart ourselves in democracy and in our own model these past 20 years, and partly for good reason, because of a lot of internal failures. But there needs to be, the effort has to be here, basically.
So Megan, playing devil's advocate again. So the Chinese are able to plan many decades in advance. They can talk about what roads they're going to build a decade, 2 decades from now. They can do huge investments in AI and other, and other high-tech areas without needing to rely on companies as intermediaries. Isn't that a real challenge for our society? And isn't it? Shouldn't we take that on board?
Yeah, I think that, look, I'll say something a little bit heretical for a libertarian, which is that I think industrial policy can work. I just don't think the odds are very high. German industrial policy in the 19th century was really good, and it worked, and it was very good for Germany. The problem is everyone who tried to replicate it just turned it into a disaster. And I think that that's one answer, honestly, is that you can't necessarily do what the Chinese did, first of all, because you're not the world's biggest country moving, hundreds of millions of immiserated peasants who were victims of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution into the cities. That's not a feat that anyone else can replicate. It was a one-shot deal. But I do think that it's also correct that we had way too much faith in the idea that liberalism was all just a big, awesome package. And you would have, if you had political liberalism, you would get rich, and if you had market liberalism, you would get political liberalism, right? And the problem is that the Chinese read the same op-eds we did, and they're terrified of it. And so they have, as they've liberalized in the last 10 years, they've actually cracked down, right? Instead of getting more open, they're getting less because they don't want that political disruption. But I will say this, is that ultimately, I think they are still vulnerable to political liberalism, and that will look bad. At the moment, I'm always fascinated by the fact that even Adolf Hitler, like the worst dictator in history, right? He's still, instead of making armaments, at the height of the war, he's producing pots and pans because he's terrified of the Junkerfrau, right? Is that even terrible repressive regimes are actually quite terrified of their vast middle classes. And the bigger China's middle class, the minute that the Chinese economy hits a wall, which I think it will for a bunch of reasons, one of which is demographic, and the other is that I actually think they are approaching the limits of what state planning can do. Stalin could build steel mills, but getting to a more advanced economy is really hard without liberal institutions. I think that the government's going to be under tremendous pressure to change the repressive practices because the Chinese don't like them any better than we would.
Brian?
Yeah, I agree with those 2 points as well. I think the demographic long-run challenges that China faces are very, very real, and I do believe you're starting to see the limits to what state planning can achieve just in terms of their own inequality problems and what's happening there. So I won't say anything more about that, but I think that it's very difficult for us to predict how these two models will fight on the world stage and how the rest of the world will perceive them going forward. There are a lot of contingencies there. But I would come back to a point, and Allister alluded to this, and it's sort of where I started, is my biggest concern is the internal threats that we have to our own model and the kind of the institutional sclerosis that we have and the loss of confidence in the ability for us to create a society in which dynamic activity proliferates and where it's available to a lot of people. And the loss of confidence about that concerns me in greater degree than actually what threat China poses. That's where I'm most concerned. Because I think over time, you can change to the point where it becomes very difficult to recover those institutions and practices, and none of us knows exactly where that point in time is. I think that the increase in support we read a lot about the increase in support for socialism among young people. It's really a collapse in confidence in capitalism that we're fighting. The interest in moving in a socialist direction in the United States is not really growing all that rapidly among young people. It's this loss of confidence that we can do the things that we were doing in the past, which I think is our biggest challenge. So we need to actually believe that these institutions can work more robustly again. And then I would bet that we would do fine on the world stage. But I think our threat's primarily internal at this point.
So we've gotten through most of this conversation without talking about either Trump or Brexit, or not very much.
It's been quite an effort.
Sorry, it was quite an effort. I tried hard, but I'm gonna actually focus the last question on those two dual, somehow related, not exactly the same, but nevertheless at least temporarily intertwined issues, and or phenomenon. And I would ask each of you to reflect a little bit as we finish this panel and begin to think about the trade panel, which comes next, how much of this crisis that we all feel, the political crisis in Britain that seems kind of ongoing and never ending, and the political crisis in Washington, how much of these are really just to do with these two issues? In other words, if Trump goes away and is replaced by either President Joe Biden or President Mike Pence or President Pompeo. And if Brexit is somehow resolved one way or the other and it's somehow off the agenda and we return to normal arguments about tax rates, how much of the current crisis is just about this and how much of it will, or are we now in some kind of permanent, 20-year downward spiral because of these two things? Or are these just accidents that will at some point be over and we'll be talking again about the special relationship and planning to do exciting things together? Sorry, that was a long question. Ryan, go.
I tend to think that they're more accidental than they often get talked about, and that's where I'm pessimistic about a lot of things. I do have some optimism in our ability to get beyond these things. I think the Brexit challenge is a bigger one than Trump. I think Trump, we have an end date, either 2020 or 2024, and even though his party has been completely refashioned under him, it can change again. The parties can change depending on who the leadership is. I think that what I see when we've done this kind of deep dive survey research and asked a lot of questions that haven't been asked in 20 years, what we see is that there is a resilience among Americans. There's a limit to what identity politics can do, for instance. People are still more likely to say they have a strong sense of community from the town where they live than they are their political ideology or their race or ethnicity, by twice as much. And people are not as fractured and atomized as the loneliness stories say that they are. We keep reading about a loneliness epidemic. Big skeptic about that. It's real where it's real. It's not real everywhere. My point is, and I've talked about the American Dream earlier, there's a number of different data points where you can look and see that people are open to an optimistic view of the future if they see one. They haven't really received that recently. We are coming off of a financial crisis which had long-run effects on people's kind of collective psyche, and so our political class has manipulated that. But I think it's possible for people to be invigorated by and inspired by a new, more optimistic agenda than we think it is right now. And I think, at least in America, I don't think the parties have been fundamentally altered in that way. They're weakened, but I don't think it prohibits. I don't think our situation prohibits new leadership from proposing things that people could actually get excited about.
I think the political crisis in this country is more permanent than merely being an accident of Brexit happening. First of all, I don't think Brexit itself was an accident. Obviously, all political outcomes are accidents. Anything, things can go either way. There's all sorts of events, all sorts of reasons for things. But I think Brexit is symptomatic of things going wrong in this country over a period of time and a growing gap emerging between governed and the ruling class, the political establishment and other elites. So I think, and I support Brexit, obviously, it goes without saying. But I think that even if Brexit happens, which it may or may not happen, and even if it's executed in a very good way and is accompanied by all sorts of other things like the Tories suddenly coming up with a great Brexit economic policy and all sorts of other unlikely events all happening together, which would be the optimal outcome. I still don't think the crisis will go away because I think a lot of the UK's political institutions are broken, basically. I think the structure of government's broken. And I think the country is very divided along new cleavages. We've moved away from old class-based cleavages to new class-based cleavages. We've moved away from certain ideological clashes to new ideologies. You've got culture that matters, identity, you've got relationship to the EU, because even if we leave the EU for the next 50 years, I suspect people remember what side they were on during the referendum. I think this is one of those very long-term events like the Corn Laws or other very large events that, that sort of make a mark on people's psyche more or less permanently. So I think that's not going away. And I'm more negative about social media probably than most people. I think social media is incredibly corrosive to the ability for people to have intelligent discussions about things. So I think it becomes very difficult to make sophisticated arguments or nuanced arguments. I think emotion, it sort of turbocharges emotion and means that rationality and rationalism is in massive decline. So I'm finding it very hard to see how we can progress, how we can unite over things, and how we can rebuild all these institutions. So I'm generally speaking quite negative about the future of the political system. I think there's hope. It might get fixed, but equally, there may be many years of problems.
So, Megan, you heard a positive spin and you heard a negative spin.
Let me see if I can synthesize.
Let's see if you can synthesize or choose sides.
Right. So, I will first agree that social media is it's sort of a refuge for those who want to spend their days being extremely angry, and that's generally unhealthy. And I think that is politically toxic, but I also think it's limited. I think that we overestimate it because we're marinated in it. And because people like us tend to be on Twitter. I mean, journalists, right, are like the biggest users of Twitter almost. And because we are so much on social media and feel like we have to be professionally, we overestimate the influence it has on ordinary people and ordinary politics. Second thing I will say is that I don't think that Trump or Brexit were coincidental in the sense that there was an element of luck, but that's always what you see with disasters, right? Is that it's a combination of having done something dumb and having had a lot of bad luck. It's never one or the other. You need the circumstances to be right. These sorts of accidents could not have happened 25 years ago. The fact is that there was an environment where the accidental portion could go through and had a decent likelihood of going through, and that's a problem. That is there are underlying structural issues there having to do with the kind of structure of society. I do think that a lot of this is demographic. We're processing a transition that no human society in history has ever gone through. And I think that that's just going to have a lot of interesting...
You mean from majority old?
From majority young to majority old, right? We're inverting the pyramid, and that's never been done before. And that's going to have all sorts of implications for economics and therefore for politics. But I am generally hopeful. In the end, I think that the third thing, the synthesis that I would offer is this, is that there are broken things in our politics. There are broken things in our economic models. There are broken things in those of us who advocate for market liberalism and political liberalism. But that's been true before, right? And you know what? The way that those broken places get fixed is that people look around, and often, I can't put forward, what is the theory that's going to save American politics or British politics or the Anglo-Saxon model. What I can say is that the way these things are usually found is by stumbling around and trying a bunch of stuff, and then eventually you find the stuff that sticks. And we've heard a lot of great suggestions up here on stage. There's probably a lot of others that we didn't think of. And that ultimately the way we're gonna make liberalism, once again, a heroic model for the world, is to do the liberal thing of just throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall, seeing what fits and works, and making the model better. And that is ultimately why I think that this model beats anyone else's, because it is really good at doing that thing.
And I will finish by saying I also think one of the things that we can do, is be incredibly honest about what the problems are, not paper them over, not pretend they don't exist, focus on them, talk about them at places like this, and work on solutions. Anyway, with that final quasi-optimistic note, we stop. I don't know, is there a break now, or is there not a break? There's a break. Okay, there's a break, and then the next panel will discuss the coming terrific US-British trade agreement, right? So, thank you. Thank you.